I've stumbled across an alleged coronavirus whistleblower on Reddit who apparently spills the beans on a piece that he wrote. He, of course, withholds his identity. The posting titled, "I am a senior Chinese military intelligence officer, and I know the truth about the coronavirus outbreak. It is far worse than the media are telling you." Now, this does read like a dystopian novel, in my opinion, and you can check it out for yourself so you can make up your own mind as to whether you believe this to be entirely legit or not. I think there's a certain level of plausibility with the intel this individual provides, but like I said, I don't want to, precondition what you formulate for yourself, of course. But I'm going to skip past the introduction part of this and get to the point where it says, "Let me return to the virus." I think one reason why I want to talk about this is actually the question as to whether or not this coronavirus is actually a bioweapon used targeting the Hong Kong protesters has been raised. And I actually read a report, the earliest report that I've actually seen related to the coronavirus. We wasn't really hearing much about the coronavirus until around the 24th or 25th of January, or maybe a little bit before that. But the earliest one I found was on January the 5th, where at that particular time, approximately 44 people, or maybe a little over that, in Wuhan had actually been infected. But first, I want to talk more about this alleged whistleblower report here. This individual begins by talking a little bit about the protests in Hong Kong and how last year, of course, and basically how the Chinese Communist Party viewed the protests as a grave threat to the stability of mainland China. And the CCP had been secretly working on a biological agent that was supposed to make the protesters docile and obedient. And this whistleblower claims to have worked on that project. "We tried to develop a sort of spray that could be dispersed from helicopters or drones, and that would lead to mental retardation and behavioral change." They decided to do some trial runs before releasing it onto the Hong Kongers, though. I'm sure you've heard about the Islamic radicals, the Muslims who are in China. They've been rounded up into re-education camps. So this whistleblower claims that that basically experimentations were projected onto these Muslims for trial runs, of course. "We exposed the inmates to various alpha experimental agents, as these were odorless and invisible. The subjects were not aware that they were taking part in medical trials. The resulting high rates of cancer, premature dementia, suicidal depression, and death by organ failure could easily be suppressed, as the camps are located in very remote parts of our motherland. Once the initial experiments had yielded a beta agent, it was transported to Hubei province, where it was deployed in a special military testing facility outside the city of Wuhan." This is, of course, the level 4 bioweapons lab that everybody's already been hearing about, the one that's really close to the wet market there in Wuhan, of course. And the Chinese, using their social credit system that allows them to identify disloyal, counter-revolutionary, and bourgeois elements in their society, using the social credit scores, which are taken from online activity, electronic shopping behavior, and reports from informers in civil society. This is right out of 1984, of course. "We selected some of the worst offenders. These included human rights lawyers and activists, Christians, homosexuals, artists, intellectuals, people who speak foreign languages, and other undesirables. Once these troublemakers had been collected and placed in the testing facility, we exposed them to the agent, which is biochemical in nature and spread in an invisible aerosol akin to certain viruses. Initial results were encouraging, as we saw significant cognitive decline and reduction in higher mental processing facilities. Essentially, our undesirables were becoming mildly mentally disabled, which is precisely the effect we wanted to produce in order to pacify the restive population of Hong Kong. But unfortunately, other very bad side effects set in. About a week after the retardation set in, the subjects developed major anxiety and panic attacks. Eventually, they developed symptoms akin to those of paranoid schizophrenics. At that point, their bodies rapidly deteriorated. They developed massive internal bleeding. The walls of their arteries dissolved. They bled out of their eyes and orifices, and their tissue disintegrated. To put it in a more direct Western manner, they started to melt. Death usually occurred through multiple organ failure. This was preceded by at least 5 days of severe agony, which could not be alleviated by painkillers. It was at this time I first violated our protocol. He basically helped an old lady who was suffering, who was begging for death. He shot her, basically. But we decided that our agent was unusable. It was far too destructive for our purposes. We wanted the Hong Kongers to submit to us, we didn't want to exterminate them. He then goes on to talk about the CIA's interest in this particular agent, and they were wanting to collect a sample from the Chinese so they could resolve certain difficulties in Venezuela, as they hinted, of course. But there was an internal battle going on. There were some folks on the Chinese side, they didn't want to release it because it was too toxic. Well, the CIA found one individual that they could offer they offered a bunch of money to, and this particular person agreed to sell them a specimen. We found out just in time for the handover and tried to stop it from happening, and the ensuing shootout. Don't bother to look for it in the news. It was never reported anywhere. Several dozen people were killed. More importantly, however, the agent escaped. Well, the handover location and the shootout actually occurred at the wet market, the meat market in Wuhan, of course. While this was happening, the sealed vial was dropped, and of course it shattered, and that's how the agent escaped. It was not due to animal to human transmission. At this point, it was realized that the agent had escaped and would start to spread, so they swiftly put all of Wuhan into lockdown. This whistleblower says, I was one of those tasked to manage the fallout of the contamination. So they ordered the state media to report that a, quote, coronavirus had broken out in Wuhan. So that way, he says that the coronavirus was basically all made up. They basically decided to have doctors diagnose people who was showing signs of the common flu or even pneumonia. They were ordering the doctors to diagnose them as having the coronavirus, which allowed them to hide the true nature of the disease. So as you are going to see here, they decided to hide the outbreak or the escape of this bioagent. They decided to hide it within the fake coronavirus outbreak, which was nothing more than just a simple common flu or the pneumonia, of course. The cold or flu, although infectious, was not often lethal. While this frightened the public, it allowed us to push the narrative that the disease was not that deadly. It also gave us time to prepare for the catastrophe that was sure to come by imposing a lockdown on Wuhan and other cities in Hubei province. So while this fake outbreak is happening, as far as the coronavirus is concerned, the agent was actually wreaking havoc. Thousands upon thousands, exponentially occurring every day, of course, but they were trying to hide this. And that's apparently where you see all the videos on, coming from China, where the people suddenly, collapse, suffering a horrific death. There were so many corpses that they didn't know what to do with them, so they had the surviving social credit prisoners to drive the bodies into the countryside and bury them in mass graves. But it was very difficult to keep this activity secret, and we could not even keep up as there were so many corpses. We planted a story that 5 million residents had fled Wuhan. In reality, of course, many of those people had died from the agent. He then talks about Dr. Li Wenliang, of course, the hero doctor there who was trying to warn people early on. He actually refused to falsely diagnose flu patients with the coronavirus, so he was punished for it. He was among those sent to help transport dead bodies to mass graves. The expectation, of course, that he would be infected with the agent and die an agonizing death. But to our great surprise, he did not contract the illness. You have, of course, read that he died of coronavirus. You have been misinformed. A sergeant of the People's Armed Police injected him with a mixture of heroin and mercury that caused his lungs to deflate. He goes on to say that this agent infects literally much worse than what's being reported, infecting tens of millions and causing them all to die. He says that the reports of, tens of thousands of infections and the far fewer deaths, of course, that these are the influenza infections that have been falsely passed off as the non-existent coronavirus. The agent is far, far more contagious than that, and its fatality rate, unlike the coronavirus, is not 2%. No, its fatality rate is 100%. Nobody recovers from it. Everybody who contracts it dies. He also begins talking about his family as well. His son has basically been infected by the agent, and that his family, because he is a high-ranking military intel officer, was given access to highly sophisticated, high-technology, specialized masks to wear. Now, these are the only kinds of masks that can actually protect people from the agent, and that even ordinary doctors do not even have access to these special masks. He then makes reference to you've heard about the new hospitals that have been built literally in a matter of days. The Huashinshan Hospital. He says that these hospitals, these newly built hospitals, are actually crematories. He claims to have been given a tour of the installation by a military police officer, where he saw the truth for himself. Again, he was wearing the special biomedical mask that are only available to biomedical warfare researchers, and is not available to even to medical professionals on a commercial level. It's highly advanced technology. Basically, during this tour, he went in, and in the front of the complex, the first area, of course, he saw thousands of infected patients lying on hospital gurneys, of course, in the early stages of the disease, suffering. He then was led to the rear area called the middle section, behind metal locked gates. The patients in the front unaware of its existence. It is there that the more advanced cases are kept in what most closely resembles a mental asylum. He was struck by the stench of vomit and human waste. Here the victims suffering from disintegrating, their minds disintegrating, and endless panic attacks and psychotic episodes. Here there were no doctors, merely Black Ops military personnel. And they treated the victims very badly and cruelly, beating them with batons, spraying them with pepper spray into their eyes, kicking them with steel-toed boots. These victims were not receiving any care. They were there basically as slaves. There was one more set of doors, and beyond them lay what the corporal called the core. And it was there that I saw it, piles and piles of dead bodies, stacked on top of one another all the way to the ceiling. Thousands upon thousands of them. And as they walked through a makeshift path through all the piles of corpses, he mentions a roaring sound in the distance. The victims from the middle section were being forced to pick up and carry the dead bodies into the dark while they were beaten by the guards. It took me a little while before I grasped what was happening. I simply could not believe what lay at the end of the path in the core. It was an enormous furnace with great fires roaring within it. At any rate, the slaves who were actually dying themselves were being forced to basically dispose of the corpses into the furnace. And when they themselves died, they were simply added to the piles. And he said that also, going back to all the travel restrictions we've been hearing about, he said the primary purpose for that is to keep people from seeing the truth of the destruction occurring in the Hubei province, among other areas, of course. He then goes into the fact that there are literally dozens of these facilities being constructed all throughout China, as the agent had spread not only to every single province of the motherland, but to most other nations in the world. Fortunately, we had agreements in place with other governments. They agreed to pretend that the infections were due to a coronavirus. They were just as worried as we were that a panic might break out in their countries. He says that even the World Health Organization was also helping to release all sorts of sophisticated misinformation about having decoded the DNA of the so-called coronavirus. All this has allowed us to stave off a global panic, for now. He then mentions that the public appearance of President Xi Jinping was actually a body double, and that he is in fact hiding in an underground bunker. He then goes and talks about his son. See, when they receive these specialized masks, they wear out quickly. And they eventually were given, his son was actually given a used mask, and its effectiveness had already passed, and so he had contracted the agent and basically died. But at any rate, there's some other things in here that I'm not going to go on about, but you can check it out for yourself. Now, this particular whistleblower report, alleged whistleblower report, has also been posted on WordPress. James Pirloff tweeted it on Twitter, stating, "Many takes now on coronavirus. This post, allegedly by whistleblower Chinese intel officer, says its biochem agent was being developed to suppress Hong Kong. Says new Chinese hospitals are crematoria. Situation far worse than media says. Very bleak reading." He later tweeted, coronavirus post I tweeted, linked to earlier, alleged by Chinese whistleblower. It looked genuine enough, that's why I tweeted it. But it may also be part of clever psyop to induce fear. I haven't forgotten Bill Gates' coronavirus simulation. Read all material with caution. And on this note, I'd like to transition over to a report from strangesounds.org. Article titled Mystery Viral Outbreak in Hong Kong. This is actually coming from January 5th, as I noted earlier. Hong Kong initiates serious response level as mysterious sickness recalls deadly severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, that killed 700 people back in 2002 and 2003. This new outbreak occurs just after the government has launched a new plan to respond to unknown infectious disease, and just after the protests have started again in Hong Kong. Again, we're going back to the protests, of course. Superbugs are everywhere, so are mysterious diseases. But sometimes outbreaks really appear to be weaponized and man-made. Hong Kong authorities have moved to serious response level as fears spread about a mysterious infectious disease that may have been brought back by visitors to a mainland Chinese city. This comes a day after the government has introduced a new plan for unknown infectious disease. The mysterious viral pneumonia has infected more than 44 people in Wuhan, a town in central China west of Shanghai and about 900 kilometers north of Hong Kong. So we're obviously in the early stages of this outbreak at this point. Later, the article referring to the new government response plan, the system is new. Are they testing it? Are they introducing an unknown infectious disease to test their new government plan? Is this a first step to stop protests with bacterial weapons? Some tests have been made before, even on U.S. citizens. And a link is provided for documentation of that. Because after weeks of relative calm, Hong Kong protesters began the new year the way they'd spent much of the old one, in the streets. And the article ends with the question, so do you think this new unknown viral infection in China, in Hong Kong, could be linked to a governmental biological weapon test? Moving on now to a True News broadcast from a couple of days ago, the 19th. Empty shelves, coronavirus shortages could hit U.S. stores by April. Now, within this broadcast, they speak exclusively to a Canadian businessman who heard from his Chinese employee that the coronavirus patient zero worked at the Wuhan bioweapons labs before succumbing to the pestilence. This businessman, his name is Stan Martin, who is a high-ranking employee of a multinational IT consulting firm. His employee, who was actually a Chinese national, just returned from visiting a vacation within a Wuhan quarantine zone. She was visiting her family there. I believe there was mention that she was in the area called Chengdu. It's within the Wuhan province, the Wuhan area, of course. But at any rate, she, like I said, returned from the Wuhan quarantine zone and was basically telling her boss, this Stan Martin businessman. And like I said, I'll provide a link so you can check out the interview, which is actually in the True News broadcast I just mentioned, of course, so you can check it out for yourself. Basically, that she reported back to him what the Chinese people are actually discussing in relation to the coronavirus outbreak, and that none of them believe that it actually came from an animal to human transmission at the now infamous Wuhan wet market there, of course. They all believe, according to what people personally told her and on the Chinese social media platforms, is that they all believe that the virus originated from like I said, the bioweapons lab that everybody knows about in the Wuhan area. And that the patient zero, there is in fact, it is known that there was an individual, that the patient zero, the very first person to contract this virus, okay, was in fact an employee at the lab itself. And that this person, of course, died. And then the funeral person who was handling the corpse also contracted the virus. And this, the funeral person had experienced swelling of the eyes, and so he went to go see an ophthalmologist, who's also a virologist. This is actually the famous and the hero Dr. Li Wenliang, who was actually trying to warn people early on. Of course, he himself was arrested, and eventually he died. And obviously, yes, I'll revert back to the whistleblower report on that. Okay, but at any rate, and from there, of course, the virus just continues spreading. Of course, or the bioagent, maybe I should say. Now, this Chinese lady, who is a woman employee, like I said, of this company, was actually intending on staying over there for about 4 weeks. But as news broke earlier, I mentioned The news of the coronavirus outbreak actually began breaking at about January 11th. I was wrong before, but she actually decided that on the January 24th or 25th to cut her vacation short, and eventually arrived back to Canada on February the 3rd. But at any rate, it was actually on January 23rd that the China apparently announced that they would be enforcing a quarantine. And that's when you hear about the 5 million people who actually fled or escaped and went this way and that. But they know the numbers because over there, she mentioned that in China they have in Wuhan, they can track the people in Wuhan City through their people's cell phones. They have tracking devices on them, so they can track them. They know when they're inside the city and when they're not. So obviously there's been many varied reports and speculations as to what happened to these people, of course. But this lady employee, obviously, when she arrived back in Canada, she volunteered herself to do a 15-day quarantine before returning back to work, of course. Changing gears, I'd like to recommend everybody go to Spyroscorus YouTube channel. I'll provide a link in the description. He's been putting out excellent, I think he's been putting out some of the best reports on the coronavirus coverage, of course. He has been talking about in some of his videos about an event 201, which some of you have heard about. It actually was held on October 18th, 2019 in New York City, hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, partnered with the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funds the Pirbright Institute, owners of the coronavirus patent, and are working on the vaccine. In other words, this event 201 was actually a simulation of a coronavirus outbreak, literally occurring approximately 6 weeks before the actual coronavirus outbreak in the physical world. And so, participants included among this, once again, simulated pandemic emergency board. It's approximately 4 to 5 hour simulation. The participants included major banks, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Johnson & Johnson, logistical powerhouses, media, China's, and the U.S. CDC. But basically, once again, they it was a simulation of a coronavirus, of a hypothetical coronavirus outbreak, and complete with actual fabricated news stories about it, and how they were talking about the anti-vaxxers, and they were basically talking about how the official narrative would be formed, and they even so basically they already had all the narratives set in place before the actual outbreak even occurred. And it's funny how these simulated media reports have actually eerily mirrored what we've actually been seeing in the mainstream media today. Now, simultaneously, while this is actually happening, this event 201, back over in Wuhan, China, believe it or not, was actually held the World Military Games, represented by militants from literally 110 countries, where the UN troops were actually featured as well. So it kind of raises the question as to, was there an element of sabotage by, perhaps some black ops personnel were maybe planted among these militants at the war games, as far as that goes. Remember, this is happening literally weeks before the viral outbreak from Wuhan, of course. So basically, I just wanted to go ahead and provide you with the this information as far as the whistleblower alleged whistleblower report and the connection with the suppression of the Hong Kong protests, obviously with the bioweapon element, of course, and also getting into the event 201, the coronavirus outbreak, the simulated hypothetical one, literally 6 weeks before the outbreak actually occurred, along with simultaneously the World Military Games held, believe it or not, in Wuhan, China, where the bioweapons lab is, and where the outbreak occurred, of course. But at any rate, come back for more, follow me on Twitter, and feel free to leave a comment.